I never thought much about shadows before. They're just a part of life, always there, always following. But now, when I see my own shadow stretched out in the dim light, my skin crawls. Started 2 weeks ago. I was sitting on my couch, flipping through some channels, trying to find something to fall asleep to. The room was lit only by the flickering light of the TV and a small lamp on the table beside me. My attention was drifting when I noticed a movement out of the corner of my eye. Just a shift, like something had passed in front of the TV for a second. I blinked and looked around, but nothing seemed out of place. The only shadows in the room were my own and the ones cast by the furniture. But when I looked back at the TV, I saw it again. A shadow, darker than the others, moving across the wall, like someone was standing between me and the light source. But no one was there. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding, and walked over to the window. There was no way anyone could be casting a shadow from outside. I checked the door, too, though I knew I'd locked it. For the next few nights, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in my apartment. Every time I turned my head, I caught glimpses of that shadow, just on the edge of my vision. It seemed to be getting bolder, lingering longer. Sometimes I could swear it was standing right behind me when I looked in the mirror. But when I turned around, there was nothing. Then, last night, it got worse. I had been lying in bed, struggling to sleep. The room was dark, but for the faint glow of the streetlight outside seeping through the blinds. That's when I felt it. A heaviness, like the air had grown thick. I opened my eyes, and there it was at the foot of my bed. The shadowy figure was clearer now, more defined. It had no features, no face, but its outline was unmistakable, tall, too tall, with arms that hung unnaturally long at its sides. I tried to move, to sit up, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, frozen under its gaze, though it had no eyes. I could hear my own breathing, quick and shallow, the sound of my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure didn't move, but I felt it watching me, its presence pressing down on my chest, suffocating. I don't know how long we stayed like that, seconds, minutes, but finally, it faded, dissolving into the shadows in the corner of the room. I didn't sleep after that. Couldn't. When the first light of morning crept through the window, I felt the weight lift. I got out of bed, shaking, and searched the apartment, hoping to find some explanation. But there was nothing. But I'm not alone, am I? Even now, as I write this, I feel it nearby, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. I can't see it, but I know it's there, waiting. I don't know what it wants or why it's here, but I can feel it getting closer. Every night it comes back, staying longer, watching me with that empty, faceless stare. And I know that one night it won't just stand there. It'll do something worse. I don't know how much longer I can stand it. I didn't leave the apartment that day. I thought about packing a bag, checking into a hotel, or crashing on a friend's couch for a few nights, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the irrational belief that if I left, the shadow would follow me, and the thought of being trapped with it in an unfamiliar place was even worse. Instead, I stayed, hoping that daylight would wash away whatever horror had visited me the night before. The rational part of my mind tried to tell me it was just a nightmare, a vivid hallucination from lack of sleep or stress. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was a cold certainty in my gut, a dread I couldn't shake. By the time night fell again, I was exhausted but terrified to sleep. I spent the evening wandering from room to room, turning on every light. I must have checked the locks a dozen times. My nerves were frayed, my hands shaking as I poured myself a glass of water. I didn't turn off the TV that night, letting it hum quietly in the background, as if the noise would keep me grounded. But when the clock ticked past midnight, I felt it again, the shift in the air, that same oppressive weight. It was subtle at first, like the room had grown heavier, the corners darker, but I knew what it meant. I forced myself to stay still, gripping the edge of the couch as I strained to listen. My apartment was silent, but that silence was unnerving, almost unnatural. The TV's murmur seemed distant, muted, as if the walls were swallowing the sound. Then, in the periphery of my vision, I saw it. The shadow wasn't hiding this time. It was standing in the doorway of the living room, taller and more defined than ever, its presence overwhelming. My throat tightened, and my pulse quickened, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It moved. It wasn't fast, but deliberate, slow, almost like it was savoring the moment. Its form shifted slightly with each step, but it never fully materialized into something human. It remained a mass of darkness, its limbs unnaturally long, reaching the floor as it glided closer. I tried to stand, to back away, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Panic gripped me, and all I could do was watch as it crossed the room. There was no sound, no creak of the floor, no rustle of movement, just silence. I felt frozen again, as if that same invisible force was pressing me down, pinning me in place. It stopped a few feet in front of me. I could feel the cold radiating off of it, like a chill that settled into my bones. And then it did something it had never done before. It leaned down, its face, or the place where its face should have been, hovering inches from mine. There were no features, just an inky void where a face should be, but I felt it. I felt its presence, its intent. My breath hitched as I stared into the darkness, and for a second, I thought I saw something move within the void, an outline, like eyes, watching me from deep inside the shadow. A low, almost imperceptible whisper filled the air, like wind through a crack in the wall. It wasn't words, exactly, but something about it felt wrong, like the sound itself was clawing at my mind. My skin prickled with an overwhelming sense of dread. Then, it spoke. Not aloud, but directly into my thoughts. A voice that wasn't mine whispering in the back of my head. "You see me now." The words were barely more than a murmur, but they echoed in my skull, setting my nerves on edge. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was trapped in that moment, locked in place by its gaze or whatever it was doing to me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow dissolved, melting back into the darkness of the room. The oppressive weight lifted, and I was left gasping for breath, shaking uncontrollably. But the worst part wasn't that it had come so close. It wasn't the voice in my head or the cold that had seeped into my very bones. The worst part was the realization that it wasn't just haunting me at night. It was always here, in the corners of the room, in the spaces where light couldn't reach. It was watching, waiting. I didn't sleep after that. Couldn't. Every creak, every flicker of shadow made me jump. I kept the lights on, pacing the apartment like a trapped animal. I tried calling a friend, but the words got stuck in my throat. How could I explain something like this? They'd think I was losing my mind, and maybe I was. As the hours dragged on and the sky began to lighten, I made a decision. I was done waiting. I couldn't live like this, constantly fearing the next appearance. I didn't know if leaving would make a difference, but I had to try. Staying here in this apartment was no longer an option. But just as I began packing, I noticed something. My reflection in the hallway mirror. My shadow. It wasn't right. It moved, slightly out of sync with me, like it was lagging behind by just a second. And then, as I watched in horrified disbelief, it shifted, stretching taller, its arms elongating, taking on the same distorted form I'd seen so many times before. The reflection of my shadow, that thing, wavered, moving with a strange, unnatural grace, just slightly out of time with me. It was like watching a puppet struggle to mimic its master. Only the puppet was trying to break free, to become something else. I stepped back, slowly, my breath catching in my throat, and the shadow, it didn't follow me. It lingered by the mirror, hovering, its limbs still too long, too wrong, bending at awkward angles as if it was testing the boundaries of its shape. For a second, it just stood there, mirroring me again, but then it turned. It didn't make sense, not logically. Shadows don't turn, don't act on their own. But this one, it shifted, its head-like shape moving as though it was looking directly at me. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair behind me as a surge of raw panic gripped me. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. All I knew was that I had to get out of that room, out of this apartment now. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, my hands shaking so badly I struggled with the lock. The whole time, I could feel its presence behind me, not in the usual distant, lurking way, but close, too close, like it was waiting for me to make a mistake. My fingers finally managed to twist the deadbolt, and I threw open the door, practically leaping into the hallway. For the first time in days, I felt a brief sense of relief. The light from the hallway, harsh and fluorescent, felt safe, as if whatever that thing was couldn't reach me out here. But as I turned to close the door, I saw it again, my reflection in the hallway mirror across from my apartment. Only it wasn't my reflection anymore. It was taller, its head almost scraping the top of the frame, and its body, no, its shape, was still that same twisted, elongated form. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were dark hollows, empty, but somehow I knew it was looking right at me. For a split second, I thought I saw it smile. I slammed the door shut, breathing hard, my mind racing. What the hell was happening? How was this possible? Shadows didn't act on their own. They weren't supposed to be something real. But I knew, deep down, that this wasn't just in my head. Whatever this was, it was real, and it had been getting closer to me all along. I needed to leave. I needed to get away. The elevator was at the end of the hall, and I practically sprinted toward it, jabbing the button repeatedly with trembling fingers. The fluorescent lights above me flickered, and for a moment, I thought I heard something. A faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across the walls. My eyes darted around the hallway, but there was no one. No one except me, and my shadow. It had stretched down the length of the hall, but now it was wrong, split in jagged, unnatural directions. As the lights flickered again, I saw it distort, pulling away from my feet, as if it was trying to crawl toward me. I pressed myself against the elevator doors, heart racing, and kept hitting the button. Finally, the doors slid open with a low ding, and I threw myself inside, hammering the button for the lobby. The elevator doors closed just as the light in the hallway flickered once more, and in that final flicker I saw it. The shadow was no longer on the floor. It was standing in the middle of the hall, perfectly still, waiting. The ride down felt like an eternity. The elevator creaked and groaned, and I could feel the weight of my fear pressing in on me from all sides. Every passing floor made the tension worse, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I kept staring at my own feet, at the small, normal shadow cast by the dim elevator light. It was still there, still mine, but I couldn't stop imagining that other shadow, waiting just beyond the doors. The elevator finally jolted to a stop, and I almost fell as the doors slid open. The lobby was quiet, deserted, save for the dull hum of the night air outside. I didn't wait. I sprinted across the marble floor, bursting through the doors and out into the street. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and crisp, but I didn't stop running. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. My heart pounded, my legs burned, but I couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until I knew I was safe. But as I turned the corner, breathless and panicked, I saw it again. my shadow, stretching out beneath me in the streetlights. It looked normal for a moment. Then, the shape twisted, subtly at first, just a flicker, like a ripple in dark water. But then it grew, stretching longer and darker, pulling away from the street lamp's glow. It moved against the light, bending and contorting, no longer bound by the rules of what a shadow should be. I stumbled back, the ground spinning beneath me, and that was when I heard it again. "You see me now." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was everywhere. In my head, in the shadows around me, in the dark spaces between the streetlights. I looked down at the ground, and my shadow was no longer mine. It was standing, growing taller, darker, its edges fraying like smoke. It began to pull away from me, rising up from the ground until it stood separate, towering over me, just like it had in the mirror. Its head tilted down toward me, those hollow eyes boring into mine. I don't remember how I got home after that. I must have run, though it felt more like I was being dragged back, lured. But now, I'm sitting in my apartment again. Every light on, every door locked. The TV is on, playing static, but the sound feels far away. I haven't seen my shadow since I got back, but I can feel it. It's in the walls, in the corners, in the dark spaces just beyond the reach of the light. And I know sooner or later it will step out of the shadows again. And this time it won't stop. The lights in my apartment flickered again. I could barely breathe. Every nerve in my body was on edge, waiting for that familiar, oppressive presence to manifest itself once more. My eyes darted around the room, scanning every shadow, every corner where it could be lurking. But this time, nothing. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes, it was hard to tell. The tension in the air was suffocating, but the shadow didn't return. For the first time in what felt like weeks, I dared to let myself believe it was over. Maybe it had left. Maybe I'd outrun it. I didn't leave my apartment, though. I couldn't risk it. I needed to sleep, but the thought of closing my eyes terrified me. Then came the knock. 3 sharp, deliberate raps on my door, breaking through the quiet like a gunshot. It was almost midnight. There shouldn't be anyone at my door. I slowly stood, creeping toward the peephole, half expecting to see the shadow standing on the other side. But what I saw was worse. It was my neighbor, the old man from down the hall, Mr. Quinn. He stood there, hunched and trembling, his face pale and drawn like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and frantic. His mouth moved as if he was whispering something, but I couldn't hear what. He knocked again, more urgently this time. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct screaming at me not to open the door. But Mr. Quinn had always been kind to me. Quiet, polite, keeping mostly to himself. I couldn't just leave him out there. So, against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack. "Mr. Quinn," my voice was shaky. "Is everything okay?" His eyes snapped up to meet mine, and I saw something in them that made my skin crawl. Panic, fear, something far deeper than just exhaustion. He stepped closer, his voice low and hoarse. You need to let me in," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's watching me. It's been following me for days." My blood turned to ice. He couldn't be talking about the same thing, could he? But the look in his eyes, the desperation in his voice, it mirrored my own fear too closely. The moment he crossed the threshold, he collapsed into the nearest chair, his breath ragged and uneven. I shut the door quickly, locking it behind him. "What do you mean, it's been following you?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "What is it?" Mr. Quinn looked up at me, his face drawn tight with terror. "The shadow. It's not yours. It's never been yours." My heart skipped a beat. "What?" He shook his head, his hands trembling in his lap. I've seen it before. Years ago. I thought I escaped it, but it found me again. It always finds a new host, a new body to latch onto. I watched it happen to my wife years before we moved here. Took her. It's doing the same to you now. A cold chill ran down my spine. What do you mean it's not mine? Mr. Quinn leaned forward, lowering his voice to a barely audible whisper, as if speaking too loudly would draw the thing's attention. The shadow isn't following you. It's never been your shadow. It's been hiding in you. It's been looking for a way back into the world. My mind reeled. Hiding? In me? No, that didn't make any sense. Couldn't be true. That's impossible. I've seen it. You've seen what it wanted you to see, he interrupted, his voice urgent. It's been manipulating your senses, your perception. The more you feared it, the stronger it got. It's been feeding on your fear, waiting for the right moment to take control. I staggered back, the room spinning around me. Take control? Of me? Mr. Quinn nodded grimly, his eyes hollow. I watched it happen to my wife. She saw it everywhere, just like you. She thought she was being haunted. But in the end, it became her. She disappeared into it. I could barely recognize her. The last time I saw her, she wasn't herself anymore, couldn't breathe. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in, suffocating me. The shadow, the thing that had been tormenting me for weeks, it wasn't just following me. It was waiting for me to break. And then the truth hit me. All this time, I had been terrified of the shadow, thinking it was something external, something separate from me. But it had been inside me all along, becoming me, like a parasite feeding on my fear, growing stronger as my sanity unraveled. Every flicker, every whisper, it had all been leading to this moment. Suddenly, Mr. Quinn's eyes widened, and he shot up from the chair, backing away from me. No, it's too late, he muttered, his voice shaking. It's already inside you. I can see it now. What do you mean? I took a step toward him, but he recoiled in terror, as if seeing something that I couldn't. Then I felt it, a sharp, twisting sensation in the pit of my stomach. My limbs felt heavy, like they weren't entirely my own. I looked down and my shadow, the one I thought was gone, began to shift beneath me, its edges fraying, breaking apart into something unrecognizable. But this time it wasn't moving away from me. It was melding with me. I gasped, trying to pull away, but my body wasn't listening anymore. My movements felt sluggish, as if something was dragging me down, deeper into the darkness. The world around me began to blur, the walls stretching and warping in my vision. Mr. Quinn backed up against the wall, eyes wide with horror. It's too late, he whispered. It's becoming you. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth moved, but the words didn't feel like mine anymore. My body, it didn't feel like mine. My thoughts became disjointed, fractured, as the shadow tightened its grip on my mind, twisting everything I knew into something dark and alien. And then, through the haze, I heard my own voice, calm, cold, and unrecognizable. I see you now. The last thing I saw was Mr. Quinn's horrified expression as he turned and ran from the apartment, leaving me alone with the thing I had feared the most. Alone with myself, or whatever I had become. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at the empty doorway where Mr. Quinn had fled. Time seemed to stretch and bend, the seconds slipping away like sand through my fingers. My body no longer felt like my own. It was as if I was floating just beneath the surface of my skin, watching myself from a distance, disconnected. The room was quiet, eerily still, but in that silence, I could feel something shifting inside me. It wasn't just the shadow anymore. It had merged, become a part of me, or perhaps I had become a part of it. The boundaries between us had dissolved. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was calm. I turned slowly, my movements deliberate, controlled, and made my way to the mirror in the hallway. The apartment seemed unfamiliar now, as though the walls had grown tighter, closer, yet that sensation no longer bothered me. The fear that had once gripped me, that gut-wrenching dread, it was gone, replaced by a strange sense of peace. When I reached the mirror, I stopped, staring into my own reflection. For a moment it seemed normal, just me. But as I watched, our shadow shifted again. It moved in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, its edges quivering like a dark flame caught in an invisible wind. And then, slowly, my reflection smiled. A smile that I hadn't intended. A smile that didn't feel like mine at all. The room around me dimmed, and I realized with an eerie sense of detachment that the shadows in the apartment were no longer just reflections of objects. They pulsed, alive with something malevolent, stretching from the corners and creeping along the floor, as though they were drawn to me. I looked deeper into the mirror, into my own eyes, and for the first time I saw it. The thing that had been hiding all along. It was there, behind the surface of my gaze, watching. Not just a shadow, it had a consciousness, an intelligence that had been lurking, waiting for its moment to take over. And now it was fully awake, fully in control. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words that came out weren't mine. They were deeper, darker, laced with an inhuman resonance that made the air around me hum. At last, the voice said, my voice, but not mine. My body felt stronger, lighter. I could feel the shadows around me gathering, like they were drawn to me, eager to follow. My mind was still there, but submerged, like a distant echo of who I used to be. I was no longer afraid. In fact, I felt powerful. The apartment felt too small now, too confining. I walked to the door, and the shadows followed me, swirling around my feet like loyal pets. I opened it slowly, stepping out into the hallway. It was quiet, still dark outside, but I knew what I had to do. The thing inside me, it wasn't satisfied. It wanted more. It wanted others. As I made my way down the hall, I felt the presence of the shadows stretching out ahead of me, moving faster, eager to spread. I passed the door to Mr. Quinn's apartment, and for a moment, I considered knocking. I could still hear his terrified voice in my head, telling me it was too late, that it had already taken me. But I didn't knock. Instead, I kept walking, my footsteps silent, the shadows sliding along the walls like living things, drawn to the light outside. As I stepped into the night, the city felt different. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, and they moved, not with the wind, but with intent, slithering across the pavement as if responding to my presence. I was no longer prey, no longer the terrified victim of a shadow creeping in the dark. I was the shadow now, the thing that others would fear, that would slip into their lives, unnoticed at first, growing stronger with every flicker of doubt, every pulse of fear. I would find them, those who were vulnerable, alone, just like I had been, and I would take them just as it had taken me. The night stretched out before me, endless, full of possibilities. And as I walked into the darkness, the city's shadows moved with me, alive, waiting to claim their next host. I smiled again, but this time the smile felt right. It was mine now. I was the shadow.